Let me just go back to the beginning here, just for the sake of those that aren't able to be with us. We're going to make sure that we have it on the recording. So I'll go back to chapter 2 to verse 1, just to repeat again. B'ni im tikach amarai umatzatai titzpon itach.
My child, if you take up my sayings and my commands you store within.
Lahakshiv lechochma oznecha tate libecha latvuna.
To hearken to wisdom, incline your heart to discernment.
Ki im labina tikra latvuna titen kolecha.
For if you call on understanding, a trusted mother, raise your voice to discernment.
Im tevakshena kakasef v'kamat monim techapsena.
If you seek her like silver, search for her like a hidden treasure.
Az tavin yirat Adonai v'dat Elohim timtza.
Then you will understand reverence of the Lord and you will find divine knowledge.
Okay, so Arthur, we're on to verse 6 now, if you're with me. Ki Adonai yiten chochma mipiv dat utvuna.
Is it like a dog?
The Lord provides unbounded wisdom, from his mouth discerning knowledge.
Itzpon laisharim toshia magen lahol cheitom.
He stores wisdom. God is the foundation of truth, a shield for the simple.
Linsor orchot mishpat v'derech hasidav yishmor.
To safeguard the paths of justice and to protect those who choose to walk them.
Az tavin tzedek umishpat umesharim kol ma'agal tov.
Then you will understand righteousness, justice, and fairness, each its good pathway.
Ki tavo chochma belibecha v'dat lenafshecha yin'am.
When wisdom enters your heart and knowledge will sweeten your palate.
Great. Okay, so we'll go on to Morton now. Mezima tishmor alecha tvuna tinatz reka, verse 11.
You will perceive the order of the universe, and discernment will safeguard you.
Lahatzlicha miderech ra meish midaber tahapuchot.
You will be rescued from your own dark inclinations, from twisted speech.
Haozvim orchot yosher lechet bedarchei choshech.
Not even the cleverest lies will deceive you onto the ways of darkness.
Asmechim la'asot ra yagilu betapuchot ra.
They rejoice in evil doing, wandering in the dark.
Asher orchotehem ikshim unozlim b'maglotam.
Whose paths are crooked and twisted by clouding mind with words.
Okay, Alan, we're on verse 16 if you want to join us.
I just joined you, but could you tell me which chapter we're on? Because I don't seem to find this.
Chapter 2, verse 16.
I didn't receive it. I'm going to have to go check my emails to find it.
Okay, no problem. All right, so let's go back to Shirley, verse 16. Lahatzilcha mi isha zara minochriya amareha hechelika.
To save you from an adulteress, from a smooth talking stranger woman.
Ha'ozevet aluf ne'oreha ve'et brit Eloheha shachecha.
Who abandons the guide of her youth and the pact of her God she forgets.
Ki shacha el mavet beita ve'el refaim magloteha.
For her house leads downwards to death and her pathways into the shade.
Kol ba'eha lo yeshuvun ve'lo yasigu orchot chaim.
All who choose this road to her shall not return and will not attain the living pathways.
Leman telech b'derech tovim ve'orchot tzadikim tishmor.
Choose differently so that you walk the good path and keep the just paths.
Okay, in the last two verses, Ki yesharim yishkenu aretz utmimim yivatru va.
For the upright dwell on earth, and the wholehearted survive upon it.
Usharim me'eretz yikaretu uvogdim yischu mimena.
Yet the wicked are driven from every place on earth, and the traitors have nowhere to call home.
Okay, great. So that's the 22 verses of chapter 2. Do you notice any themes, patterns, or structural keys that might give us a clue as to how this is operating and what the purpose of this chapter is in these 22 verses? At the outset, it seems a little bit opaque, but there is a theme and there is a structure. So what do you notice if you are looking specifically at the way that's put together? Do you notice anything? Morton, what do you notice?
Well, there are the two women, the woman of wisdom, and then the adulteress,
Mhm.
and they represent the two forks in the road, so to speak,
Mhm.
the path and the path of evil and despair and essentially death, I guess, when she talks about going down to the shades.
Mhm.
I'm not sure if I could just comment on the translation for a second.
Mhm.
I'm not sure why you raise the adulteress to a capital A and refer to her as, in some sense, a deity, which is what the capital, in my mind, does. I can understand why you're doing that with wisdom, because
Mhm.
we've talked about her as being the feminine side of Elohim, but I'm not sure about the adulteress.
It's a very good observation. I'm playing with it right now to try to figure out in English how to convey some of the things going on in the Hebrew, because the Hebrew is playing with archetypes. So if we're talking about symbols and archetypes, the question is, does that make the archetype, which is a symbol of something, and obviously in opposition to um, the other symbol, does it make it a deity? I'm not so sure, but I understand what you're saying. Well, let's go through it and we'll see what exactly is going on, specifically with the Isha Zara that I translated as the adulteress and the Nochriya, the stranger woman. We'll talk about it some more. This is a work in progress, but there's clearly an opposition that is at play here that this chapter is set out. It is one long acrostic poem again that we're dealing with, and actually this section echoes a structure that's similar to Proverbs 31, which we'll return to and review again down the road. But if you remember, Proverbs 31, 10 through 31 was the acrostic poem that followed the alphabet, and it described the woman of valor, the Eshet Chayil, the self-reliant, independent woman of valor. So that was 31, 10 through 31. And now here, there is an acrostic at play, but it's a very limited acrostic. If you look at verses 1 through 11, as opposed to 12 through 22, part of what comes up, depending on how it's laid out on the page here, it's not entirely consistent, but it does seem to work through most of it, is that 1 through 11 has a predominance of the letter aleph, and 12 through 22 has the predominance of the letter lamed. So you have, again, it's not consistent through all the verses. It sometimes comes up not in the first letter of the first word, but sometimes it's in the first letter of the second phrase, like in the B part of the verse. But there is a pattern of aleph in the first 11 verses and lamed in 12 through 22. And when we take that together, what does that spell?
L.
Aleph and lamed together.
L.
Hail.
Right. So it spells out either towards or it could be the name of a god, or it can spell out al,
Oh.
which is a negative, right? Right, like lo tirtzach or al tirtzach, do not murder. That many of the negative commands are in the language of al. So some have suggested that perhaps this is part of what Morton was referring to, is there's a contrast set up here between the fork in the road. Here's the path to take, and here's the path not to take, right? And um, the um, the Aleph verses tend to focus more on how to cultivate and gain wisdom, whereas the Lamed verses from 12 onwards draw our attention to the pathways that will veer and swerve away from wisdom. That's a general attempt to try to give it some structure, but there is a real strong juxtaposition of good and evil here, right? And so it's up to the student now to choose the path that's being mapped out from the mentor at the outset, which we saw already at the beginning of chapter 1. Now, one of the things that also is interesting in the first 4 chapters as well is again the focus on, look at some of the verbs that are being used, right? There is a need, in order to be able to receive wisdom and to take up these sayings, to be doing a couple things that are continuing and a pattern in these in the verbs that are being used. What are some of the patterns of the verbs that you see in the first 4 verses? Right, part of it is active. Okay, the wisdom and the commands eventually become stored within you, which is interesting. But you have to hearken to wisdom, and you have to incline your heart to discernment. Really, like in verse 2, I would tweak it and say, "Lakshiv lechochma oznecha," to hearken. In many ways, it's to hearken your ear, to hear wisdom, to incline your heart to discernment. There is an active focus and attention that's required, right? To be calling on understanding, and then you also have to be able to raise your voice in the relationship between the teacher and the student. And there was also an active element of searching, right? This verse 4 is really quite beautiful in terms of the imagery that describes what the part of this relationship is about between the teacher and the student, right? That if you seek her like silver, search for her like a hidden treasure. So there, the 2 verbs that are used are tevakshena and techapsena. Okay, so they're declined in the feminine. So here again, it's referring back to wisdom. But levakesh and lechapes are 2 verses, are 2 verbs that relate to seeking and to searching. So it's something that has to be sought out and searched for, and then ultimately becomes stored up like a treasure chest within you. And this is a process of finding the hidden treasure, both from the perspective of the student as well as the teacher. But it's a theme that comes up quite a bit in both in chapter 2 as well as in the rest of the book.
Well, I don't remember exactly where, but it seems to me that everything in this verse we've already studied. He's already made all these points. We talked about the 2 paths. We talked about the adulteress. We talked about you have to seek out wisdom. It just seems to me that it's repetitious.
Does it feel like it's repetitive from chapter 1, or is there something new that's being laid out here?
Well, if there's something new, I don't know what it is.
Well, we are seeing a repetition of motifs. That's true. One of the things specifically in verses 4 and 5 that is important to appreciate is is this specifically Yirat Adonai, this sense of reverence, right? And the relationship of reverence of the Lord to divine knowledge that can be found. It's beginning to parse out part of the project of what Proverbs is trying to instill. And remember, we talked about the structure of the book that in many ways is structured with these kinds of pillars. So reverence is something that is considered to be an important part of the pillars for creating this structure, this house of wisdom. Because if you are able to cultivate um, a balance in terms of the qualities of specifically here of reverence, then it bodes well for a life that has a sense of equanimity, right? So remember that the word for yirah can be translated, depending on the context, either as fear or as reverence. And part of what the sage is trying to teach and to model and suggest here is that reverence, the sense of yirah, is a most precious treasure that many seek after, which suggests that we don't always find it right away. Remember, we talked last time together about the difference between the maternal and the paternal approach to wisdom, right? That in that verse in chapter 1 that speaks about Musar Avicha and Torati Mecha. Remember the difference, the distinguishing features of those approaches to sharing wisdom. Musar Avicha, Bev suggested the translation of not just the ethical behavior, but it was the paternal guardrail, right? The regimen of discipline to try to keep you on the right path. And that may also sometimes require, if you think about it as a parent, what does that require in terms of discipline? In order for discipline to be effective, there has to be a sense of yirah. And how do we translate yirah here in that context if discipline is to be effective? Elyssa?
Yeah, I just wanted to go back, Rabbi. You said that that if we did these things, that like if we hearkened to our heart to wisdom, and if we called out to discernment, that we would store knowledge. And how do you get from the passage that it applies to us? Because it says that God stores the knowledge, and I'm just wondering how do you interpret that as applying to us too? Is that because of we're made in the image of God, or is there some other mental leap that I'm missing there?
I think it's a good observation. Part of the assumption, and we're going to see this later with the cosmic plan of wisdom, that God co-creates with wisdom, with chokhmah. We're going to see that in 8 and 9, and we are created in the divine imprint. So that implies that this is stored within you in the same way that I've stored it within the universe that I've created. So there's something about the way of talking about this, and this is what's sometimes confusing about wisdom literature in general and Proverbs in specific, is there's a simultaneous concern with character and cosmos, right? So we're looking at character development and we're also looking at the creation of the cosmos. So it's character and creation of the cosmos, character development and creation of the cosmos. And what is trying to be articulated here is the fact that there is a relationship between the two of them. The more that we cultivate our character, the more that we become aware of the ongoing influence of the creation of the cosmos. And the more that we become aware of God's power in creating the cosmos, the more that we become concerned about cultivating our character. They're intertwined. So that is to say that if you look at the book of Proverbs, you can't say that it's only concerned with, I'll give you 2 words to think about, with it's an anthropocentric concern or a theocentric concern, meaning that it's only concerned with human issues or human concerns, or it's a book it's only concerned about a divine perspective or divine concerns. The truth is that they're intertwined. And this is a place where, as you said, because we're created in the divine image, that's why we're concerned about this. Otherwise, it would be a book about cultivating wisdom that you can find on a self-help bookshelf in the bookstore, right? How to be able to help yourself without a relationship to a higher power. But helping ourself means we have to do that and cultivate character and relationship to a cosmic creator, and vice versa, and become aware of the cosmic implications of a creator who creates the world with wisdom that has implications for us because we're created in that imprint. So there's a constant back and forth between the micro and the macro, and that means that it's stored up not only within the cosmos, but also stored up within us.
So
And
if we, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, if that's the case, going like sort of extrapolating that back to our conversation about the Aleph and the Lamed,
Mm-hmm.
I noticed something interesting, which is that you could argue that or you could see the Aleph and the Lamed referring to Adam and Lilith.
Mm-hmm.
So
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
if you go back into the section about Genesis, about how Adam was created, there's another narrative about Adam being created both male and female, so that Adam could be considered to be, both of these things. So we don't get past the gender issue with the she, but so that these
Mm-hmm.
two forces of like wisdom and anti-wisdom are being reflected also in the creation of Adam and Lilith in our world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's very possible. That there is that the tension that's being alluded to. It's not clear how ancient that myth of Lilith is. I'd have to go back to look at Freimer Kinski in the Wake of the Goddesses, but I think we have traces of that in ancient Near Eastern culture that would probably support that. So there is the tension here, both in terms of the path to take and not to take, as well as the forces that you're going to encounter when you're on that path, which is definitely it's the warning. This is a chapter of warning or exhortation as you're about to embark on the path. Be careful, right? It's kind of a caveat emptor warning, and it's hard to know to the ancient Israelite when they would see those patterns what would be evoked for them. But it's very possible that things like lo or al could have been evoked. It could have been a short form as well, as you're suggesting, that takes us back to what does it mean to create the perfect being as opposed to the corrupted being, because we are concerned with how wisdom is supposed to be the floor plan, not only for creation of the world but also for the creation of the perfect human being. So that's definitely something that we have to keep in mind. Now, what I was referring to earlier, though, is when we talk about yirah, it's not intuitive necessarily that if you're talking about a child or about a disciple that you're training, in both cases, if you're trying to discipline a child or create a practice for a student or a disciple, sometimes the proclivity of the teacher or the parent is to instill fear into the child or to the disciple in order to be able to create a sense of obedience. That may be part of the way that yirah is described in sort of a foundational level. But what the teacher is speaking about here is yirah that really is more about reverence. To be in a place of reverence, of yirah, and sort of to appreciate with radical amazement how the cosmos were created, leads you to a state of understanding that the human and the divine are connected, that the wisdom that I'm seeking is in many ways an echo of or an imprint of the divine wisdom. So that may instill a sense of fear in us, a fear and trembling of being overwhelmed, but very likely the reason why it's being described at the opening here as a search and as a seeking process is because it's not necessarily self-evident. It takes work to cultivate that mindset of seeing my life in relationship to the universe from the perspective of reverence. So we talked about that before, but I'll just say it again. I'll use the terms that are used later on that are implied here but not spelled out. But when the word yirah is used later on in rabbinic literature, it's spelt out further. The sages say yirah is either yirat schar va'onesh, that is the fear of recompense and punishment, or yirat haromamut, which is the sense of radical amazement and reverence. Okay, and it's both. It's the same word, but it depends on the context and it depends on the mood of how it's being used here. I think that what's the reason why it's being spoken of as a treasure that's hidden is because yirah, the way that it's being described and supposed to be cultivated by the disciple, is a sense of reverence that is not always the self-evident posture. That it actually takes work to cultivate that. If it's valued as a most precious treasure, then that's because of its experiential quality. And that means that you have to live your life. You have to spend some time observing things that would inspire a sense of radical amazement or awe. So what would be some examples in your life as a human being, as you've grown through the ages of your book of life, that may have inspired a sense of reverence or radical amazement in your life? Can you think of some things that you've seen or experienced that have shown you the path to be amazed about things in life, to cultivate a sense of reverence? Can you think of anything that might do that? I know Bev and Morton already have an example. I think they were holding him last night.
Right. Well, before you even mention that, I was going to say the most obvious one is the birth of a baby is the cause for radical amazement.
So that's your own child, but now that you have a grandchild, does that double the radical amazement?
Well, it means that you have all the pleasure without most of the work. So, so you have time for the radical amazement.
Okay, but that's interesting. Sometimes being in a position of radical amazement actually requires a little bit of time and distance and pause to reflect, right? That's an important thing to remember.
Right. When our when our oldest son was born, someone said to us something that really has stuck. She said, "You are so lucky to have someone new to love." And that's also a reflection of radical amazement, because having a new child is not only looking at the wonder of creation, but it's looking at the wonder of the effect it has on you as an individual.
Yeah, so that can put you into a state of awe, like, wow, how is it possible in my universe of obligation in my neighborhood, suddenly I have this new being that I can love? And that wasn't there before, like a few years ago, and now suddenly from nothing there's this new child or this new grandchild that I'm just automatically in love with. How is that possible? That is kind of amazing. Okay, I'm in a state of awe. So the birth of a child or a grandchild, good. What else could put you into a state of radical amazement that you might witness in the course of your lifetime, that you may have already witnessed?
Driving from Montreal down to Lake George, we passed through an awe-inspiring landscape of the Adirondack Mountains, which, unless one actually sees it, one could never possibly imagine that it would exist.
Okay, so that's important now. And so wonders of nature,
Yes.
right? You contemplate a natural wonder, and that engenders a sense of wonder in you, right?
Yes.
And as you said, you put it very beautifully, that unless one is actually witnessing it firsthand, you could never imagine, did you say, the sense of awe that it inculcates?
Yes. Yes.
Okay, good. What else? So we have birth, we have natural landscapes. What else? Anything else that could cultivate a sense of radical amazement and wonder in us? Elyssa?
I always find that when there have been times when we've had speakers, or when we hear of somebody who's really had a tough tough Hannah cards handed to them in life, and they've really suffered, and yet they find the hope and the strength to overcome whatever it is and really do something amazing in the world.
So does that inspire in seeing someone else overcoming suffering or hardship? That inspires a sense of awe in you by witnessing them?
Yeah, because it
Okay.
makes me reconsider what I'm giving back to the world, and like their example just seems so awesome that it's actually, it makes me like it's like molecules like just sort of bubbling up, and I all of a sudden I want to also be a better person and give back more to the world and overcome my own suffering.
Mm-hmm. And so that's an awe-inspiring moment in the relationship to another human being. Okay, good. So we have now 2 human encounters plus 1 natural landscape. Anything else that you, Shirley, and then Arthur?
So I think, so there's where God creates, but there's an opportunity for when people create. And I'm thinking of something that Rabbi Sachs in one of his books talked about creation, about it's an opportunity for people to part of that act of creating. And it's like thinking of an idea, and I'm awe-inspired when people have an idea and then they're able to buildings and artists and I'm involved in an organization here, Pomegranate Guild. I was past president, and like you throw out an idea and people create, and it's just amazing. So from big to small.
So it's the creative impulse within the human mind, whether it's art or architecture or any of the arts, to see how they are able to take an idea and make it become manifest and manifest their creativity. That can be awe-inspiring. Okay, great. Good example, Shirley. Arthur, what are you thinking of?
I'm thinking of the time that I visited Israel, and I got to see firsthand all the places that we had learned about, and going and davening at the Western Wall, I thought was so awe-inspiring. I haven't gotten over it anytime I think about it. And just to see what the Jewish people did. I went more than one time, and 20 years apart, and coming back and seeing, my God, the things that were nothing are all of a sudden big, huge buildings and everything, a whole population. It was just amazing to me.
What is it about the this experience that I'm sure many of us have had of going to the land of our ancestors and seeing the traces of history that we learn about in a book? Why does it create a sense of awe in us when we see something that we've learned about or that we've talked about and it relates us to our ancestry? Why is that so awe-inspiring?
Well, to me, it just made me feel like I belong here. Here are my roots. It's someplace that you only dream about, but you're instantly part of it. You're instantly saying, wow, I love it here. Maybe I should move here. All kinds of things go through your mind to show how connected you are to it, because it's so inspiring.
So there's something about ancestry, and I think you used the word belonging, which can be powerful when you have an aha moment. It happens to a lot of people, Jews, when they go to Israel, even non-Jews, to see that there is, let's say, for example, let's say you were Christian and you went to Israel, you'd have a very similar experience because you have a vested interest in your ancestry through something like scripture, or it could be through peoplehood. But to see there's something larger than yourself that you're a part of inspires awe, right? to get that sense of perspective and to see it embedded in the landscape, that you're walking the same path that your ancestors have walked thousands of years before you is very inspiring. It does create a deep sense of awe. I had that experience for myself. The first time I was in Eretz Yisrael was for my bar mitzvah in Masada. It completely overwhelmed me. And to know that I had learned about the history of the Bar Kokhba revolt and what our ancestors were doing on Masada and why that place was important, and I was walking up the same snake path that they may have walked up, I was completely overwhelmed. I could have had a sense of fear if I thought back to what the lessons of history were, and I knew even as a 13-year-old that most of those who were holding out on Masada eventually ended up martyring themselves because they didn't want to be captured by the Romans. But even the sense of fear that would overcome me, I think I would still have been overtaken with a greater sense of awe, looking at the fact that I'm part of that history, and that's continuing to this day, and I'm still walking that snake path. That was incredibly awe-inspiring. So I think those of us that have been to Eretz Yisrael probably across the board have that sense. But to call it awe, I think is a really good example. And that's now we're talking not just about a natural landscape like Allan was suggesting, seeing the Adirondack Mountains, but now you're seeing a landscape that has been fashioned and created by human beings, by a specific tribe, by a nation. And it's more than just the creativity that Shirley was talking about, because now it's a specific people that have done something. It's not just a group of artists, which is awe-inspiring, but now this is a group of people that have created a project that has lasted. When you say what happened to, if you grew up reading the pre-Socratics and the Greeks, or you read Egyptian, hieroglyphics and philosophy, if you go to Egypt or you go to Greece and you see the temples or the hippodromes that are still, let's say, remaining in Greece, or you go to Egypt and you see the pyramids, would you have the same sense of awe?
No,
Why not?
I've been to those too, and I don't. While they inspire you, that it's amazing. Look at this. You don't get the feeling of belonging, that it's part of you. It's just something interesting to observe.
Right. So I think you're touching on the key point, is belonging. There's something that can be awe-inspiring about a sense of belonging. So that's very important. And it's interesting for us to think about all these different factors of that inspire a sense of reverence and awe, in relationship to the teacher now trying to impart this to the students. So the teacher could say, but doesn't say, you should go and walk the land of Israel. You should go and see a natural landscape. You should go and see a child being born. All the things, you should go look at a beautiful work of art. All the things so far that we've talked about are not those cues that the teacher, who is supposed to be cultivating a sense of wisdom of experience, is giving to the student. But what is said that I think is interesting and possibly speaks to some of these examples, which are personal and contextual, is to say that you need to open your ear to hear wisdom. You need to be open to experience. If you want to become wise, open yourself to all these experiences we just spoke about. And maybe as the teacher is setting out the curriculum, depending on the context of the teacher and the student, the good teacher will know how to be able to elicit this from the student. But it's not spelled out here. Okay, so that's what's I think one of the things that's interesting, that there is a need to fill in some of the blanks here. And we've spoken about the fact that wisdom literature as a genre in general, and specifically Proverbs, is very economic, elliptic, and enigmatic. These are very short phrases, 1 to 2 lines, and they do require us to unpack and to fill in some of the blanks. Okay, so that's something that is good to keep in mind, and we've just taken an example of how we do that. Let's take a look. We're going to just maybe focus our attention on these last 3 verses, and then we'll close for today. Verses 9 through 11. What are the proper traits for moral behavior that appear to be part of the curriculum here? What are the proper moral traits, the proper traits for moral behavior that need to be cultivated in verses 9 through 11? Is there something that is articulated here? right? What is it that allows you to perceive order and the discernment that will safeguard you when this wisdom enters into your heart and sweetens your palate? If you go back to verse 9, what are the three words, the three qualities that are needed to be cultivated in order to be able to take us, the student, onto the right path?
Righteousness, justice, and fairness.
Good. So those are, and it says, as then you will, tavin, then you will understand tzedek, righteousness, justice, mishpat, and mesharim, as well as kol ma'agal tov, each in its own good pathway. But it's very clear there's something being articulated here that's part of a curriculum that needs to be unpacked to understand tzedek and mishpat, to understand righteousness and justice, and mesharim, the fair pathways. Now, I draw attention to that because I found it to be interesting to see how they're clustered together. And specifically, I think there's something of, as Bev said, that Professor Robinson was referring to. There is a curricular concern here in specifying things that need to be cultivated, specifically tzedek and mishpat and mesharim. And upstanding moral behavior then allows us to cultivate that guardrail that we were talking about earlier, and becomes the guardian for wise behavior. It's very interesting, and I don't think it's accidental, that much later, centuries later, in the medieval period, the great philosopher physician Maimonides speaks again about the importance of cultivating those three specific qualities, but he adds to it not only tzedek and mishpat, justice and righteousness, he also adds to it chesed, loving kindness, and he says that if you practice these qualities, if you practice cultivating tzedek and mishpat, justice and righteousness, as well as chesed, then he goes on to explain in the Guide for the Perplexed that these qualities allow you to deepen your knowledge of God and your wisdom. But what he suggests, and this is sort of like the pièce de résistance of the entire Guide for the Perplexed, so it's spoiler alert if you want to study and read the whole thing, you're going to be disappointed because I'm giving you the final take on it. But in section 3, chapter 54, Maimonides basically sums up the whole purpose of Judaism and of the philosophic path as cultivating tzedek and mishpat and chesed, so loving kindness, judgment, and righteousness. If you cultivate and focus in deeply on the cultivation of these moral qualities, then not only do you come to know God and become wise, but you become more knowledgeable about God's providence. What does providence mean? What does the word providence mean? I may have raised it once before. What does it mean that Maimonides is speaking about? Providence or hashgacha? You may know it more in the Hebrew, because if you've ever been to a kosher kitchen, you know there's someone who is a mashgiach. What does a mashgiach do to make sure there's hashgacha? What's a mashgiach in a kitchen?
Supervisor.
The animal.
Exactly.
According to kosher rules.
Right. So it's the mashgiach is the supervisor, as opposed to the shochet, who's the slaughterer. I'm not dealing with the slaughterer yet. We're just dealing with the supervisor. So a supervisor is responsible for ensuring what about the kitchen?
The standards.
That's right. As well as what else?
The order.
The order. Good. What else?
Separation of things.
Yes, that's true. And ultimately, though, what comes out of the kitchen that's being supervised?
Food.
What is the right? And sustenance. Exactly. Sustenance. Okay. So now if you take that analogy to God as a supervisor of the universe, providence, God's providential care for the human creatures is to ensure there is order, there are standards, and there is sustenance provided for all of God's creatures. That's what providence means. Okay. Now,
the soul, we mean?
sustenance for
The soul.
both body and the soul.
Okay.
Okay. But yeah, both of them are required. That means that there is enough food in the universe to suffice so that no one goes hungry. Now, I'm sure you can show me exceptions, that there are children that go hungry to school, not just in Africa, but in Montreal. Okay, that's true. That's a whole issue it's a separate issue we'll take up in terms of the challenges of providence, to say, if there is, this is Maimonides' feeling, that if there is a God who has the three omnis, remember the three omnis we talked about before? What are the three omnis that Maimonides loved? Not the hotel.
Omnipresence and omnipotence.
Right. So there's omnipresence, omnipotence, and omnibenevolence. So that God is all good, God is all knowing, God is all present. So those three omnis are part of this larger umbrella that we call providence. Okay, for God to be a supervisor of the universe, you expect that the ideals of supervision include all knowing, all powerful, and all good. Okay, taking that analogy of the kitchen a little further, and then the question that emerges from that is, well, is the providence individual, or is it general? That is to say, does God know and supervise the universe of existence, of all of human existence, as like a general kitchen for all of humanity, or is it my particular kitchen? Okay, and that's a huge debate in the medieval period. We're not going to get into it now. Maimonides' point is, it appears as though it's on an individual level he's talking about. Here he's saying, if you want to become a sage, which is the whole purpose of his project in the Guide for the Perplexed, if you want to become a sage, what he's saying is that you need to cultivate these qualities, these midot, right? He adds chesed to the list, but basically it's the same as the rest of what's here. Tzedek, mishpat, and mesharim. You have to cultivate those qualities, and in so doing, then you increase and you deepen your knowledge of God, as well as your knowledge of God's providence. The more that you're aware of God's providence, the more that, in many ways, you are able to imitate these ways in your life, right? And what he's suggesting is this process of imitatio Dei that Judaism is teaching us, that we cultivate and reflect on and contemplate these qualities as aspirational qualities, because we want to become more like them. We want to bring them and imbue our lives with being, by cultivating these midot, I have the capacity as a human being to become more compassionate, more just, and more righteous and more fair in my life. But I have to take time to cultivate what those ideal qualities are, which come from the divine, but they affect human behavior. So the purpose of the human being, Maimonides says, is to spend regular time, this is now the curricular advice, cultivating, he doesn't tell us how, but to cultivate and ultimately to practice being more compassionate, more just, more fair, and more righteous. And that is a very concrete concern, both of Proverbs, and then later on in the medieval period, in terms of what Maimonides is spelling out, to be able to be and fulfill imitatio Dei, to imitate the ways of God. That's what it means to be a human being, is to act more godly in the world, to take these values and to find a way to deepen them in terms of my behavioral arc, and specifically the way that I move in the world should be more imbued by these qualities. And if so, then this knowledge of God's providence increases as well. Maimonides adds that on to the what's going on here, but he's saying that if I act and cultivate these attributes in my life of righteousness, justice, and fairness, then what Mishle says here in verse 10 is, then wisdom enters into your heart. Maimonides parses that out and says, to live a life of wisdom means that you will feel that God is caring for you, or at least supervising your life in a more intimate way. Okay, that's the connecting point that Maimonides makes. You may agree or disagree with that, but we have to ask ourselves the question, what is meant by verses 10 and 11, right? Once you cultivate tzedek mishpat sharim, then wisdom enters into your heart, then knowledge, that's the knowledge Maimonides is talking about, the da'at sweetens your palate, and then you perceive the order of the universe, okay? And discernment will safeguard you. That order of the universe is what we were talking about in terms of providence. To perceive the order of the universe for us gives us a sense of nachat ruach, a sense of being at ease, because we know there's an order to the universe. And once we've discerned that order, then we'll probably go and come to the conclusion by contemplating the order of the universe that there is a creator that also is responsible for not only creating it, but for supervising it. That's supposed to be a sign of wisdom, okay? As opposed to, and to keep us from our own dark inclinations, which is verse 12. Okay, so 12 and onwards now then shifts and says, here's what's going to happen to your mind if you don't allow yourself to focus on these positive, uplifting moral characteristics. Your mind will draw you in a different direction. So there's a real interesting, very early prescience that the book of Proverbs has for the way the human mind works and the need to be able to focus, right? Before we talk about meditation or CBT therapy, it's interesting to see that Proverbs is saying, just as many centuries later, as the Baal Shem Tov would say, Eifo choshev hamachshava, or Eifo hamachshava shel adam, sham hu nimtza. Wherever your mind is, that's where you are, right? Your mind puts you into a frame of reality that you experience, and so it's important to be able to cultivate a proper mind state. That's a very important insight that we may take for granted nowadays because of all the advances in psychology and cognitive behavioral therapy, as well as in meditation. We know that that's actually true psychologically and neurophysiologically, that when we focus the mind on a specific object of focus or a specific trait, that there are ways of actually being able to measure the effect that that has on our behavior and on our overall sense of well-being. So that's part of what is being discussed here, right? And there is a need to evoke what happens when you become distracted or your mind gets taken into dark places. And then, of course, there's the concern about betrayal and adultery. Now, the question was asked earlier, and I'll conclude with this for us to think about it. Morton brought it up, and Elyssa brought it up in a different way as well. Whether we can really make a capital letter for the dark side or the shadow side of wisdom, verses 16 and onwards, where I started to suggest that. Part of what happens in the Hebrew is you have indications sometimes where it's not speaking about a particular woman, but it's speaking about a symbol or an archetype of the woman, because of what's called the Hey Hayediyah, it's like the definitive article that says that this is the as opposed to a, right? This is the woman as opposed to a woman. So that's one of the things that's being evoked. It happens throughout the book of Proverbs. We're talking about the symbol and the archetype. We're not talking about a specific person. There's no name that's given, but it's this symbolic realm and the tension between these two different typologies of woman wisdom and stranger woman. As I was trying to render it. It's hard to capture it in the English, but there is a tension between the image of light and the image of darkness, the image of wisdom that goes in the right direction, and the image of knowledge that takes us in the wrong direction. Because that's part of the fear of the sage is trying to teach the disciple, right? In verse 18, this is such a strange image. What does this mean that her house leads downwards to death and her pathways into the shades? That's where Elyssa was bringing up the earlier suggestion, which makes even more sense now, about Lilith and the demonic, right? The feminine being seen as the demonic, the seductress. That's something that already is embedded in some of the early exegesis about the story of creation, that both Eve as well as Lilith were created in the process of the creation of the human being. And of course, in the Garden of Eden, when we talk about eating from the tree, that is a pivotal moment in terms of knowledge, right? You have an opportunity to eat from the tree of life or the tree of knowledge, good and evil. If the tree of knowledge, good and evil, has both good and evil in it, then it's like a fork in the road. Depends which fruit you're picking from which branch, and that's the dilemma of knowledge. And that's part of what I think is being discussed here or evoked here by the teacher to the student. Be careful what kind of knowledge you eat from the tree, because it'll either lead you to death or to life. It'll either lead you to darkness or towards illumination. It'll either lead you through the path of the seductress into the shades of death, into oblivion, or it will allow you to dwell on earth. That's the way that this ends, right? Look at 21 and 22. You want to be one of the ones who are the Yesharim Yishkanu Aretz, right? And what you want to be a Yeshar and a Tam. You want to be upright and you want to be wholehearted. And if you want to do that, follow this path. If not, then you're going to follow the other path, the path of the wicked, the path of the traitors who have no place on earth. So it's a very stark and provocative series of images that are being used to try to wake the student up to realize that everything goes back to that pivotal moment in the garden. And you now are, as a student and a disciple, you are back at the garden. You are back at the place where Adam and Eve stood before the tree of knowledge, good and evil. What fruit are you going to eat from the tree? That's the challenge that's put before us now. Okay, just using different imagery. Elyssa had a comment?
Sorry, I was muted. I was just wondering, when they use the word wisdom, how much do people understand that as referring not exclusively but predominantly to Torah?
It's a good question, because we're seeing already in chapter 1. Remember, Torah is only one piece of wisdom. It's only one vehicle, because we already saw in chapter 1, we saw Torah and Musar. Remember, Musar from the paternal side, Torah from the maternal side. So it's not exclusively Torah.
So
There are
it's
gradations.
possible to say that there might be an alternative path towards wisdom that does not go through Torah.
At this stage, Torah is only one tool in the toolkit. It's not the exclusive one. So yes, there are many, many ways, right? The sages will say later, playing on the word for heart, which also is the word for mind in Hebrew. What's that word? Does anybody remember? We came across it a couple times already today.
Lev?
That's right. Right? Remember in verse, early on in the verse 2, tated libecha, lev. Lev is the word for heart. So the sages say later on in the mystical tradition that there are lamed bet netivot chokhmah, that there are actually 32 pathways to wisdom, and they're all inscribed in the heart and the mind. One of them, of course, is Torah, but it's not the only one. So it's very interesting for us to think about that. So last comment, Bev, and then we're going to close for today. Yeah.
I'm not sure that we can handle this, but you say right now, but God's the supervisor. And you talked about children who don't have enough to eat. So how do you deal with the cases that don't work? So
Well, that's precisely what disturbed Maimonides, and that's why I was bracketing it. It's a whole other deep dive into medieval philosophy, and it's the difference. I'll just give you a one-foot answer because it's a much deeper conversation, but it's the difference between general providence and specific providence. That is to say, Maimonides squared this conversation by saying, I look around the world and I see there is evil and there is suffering. And so if God is all these omnis of omnibenevolent, omnipresent, and omniscient, then I have a problem because I can't explain evil or suffering. So what I have to do is I have to make a move here. And my move, Maimonides says, is to say, I will still uphold the possibility of supervision, but only in a general sense. That is to say, humankind in general is being supervised. But in particular, if I go hungry today, that's not a function of a defect or a problem in God's general providence. In the scheme of in the general scheme of things, there's always going to be something that is in the margin or falls by the wayside. But in general, the species of humanity in general is being cared for more or less. There will be some minor exceptions, but overall, the general project is working. Just like your kitchen more or less is working and functioning. You may have a problem with your oven from time to time. You may blow a fuse, but in general the kitchen works. So Maimonides is saying, in general, the kitchen of the universe works. And there are times where you have to call in the repairman, but overall it works. That's the way he gets out of it, and tries to sort of bracket evil and suffering as these exceptions of what he calls privations. There's a privation of God's goodness or God's light in the universe, but it doesn't affect the those three omnis. It's a bit of a convoluted argument, but that's what he's trying to say, and that's why I'm using the kitchen analogy. Shirley.
Say that with,
So,
yeah, go on. Take on.
Sorry, Bev. Go ahead. Finish up.
No, we can say that with COVID, we had the scourge, and yet we had the manpower and the seichel to devise an antidote. So that's the
well, that's a whole other ball of wax. I'm going to talk about that on Shabbat, because that's an issue. The question is you have a plague? Is that an act of nature? Is that an act of God?
Okay.
And then you have a vaccine.
Right.
Is that a miracle?
Right.
Or not? I'm going to talk about that on Shabbat and show you how Maimonides was also disturbed by the issue of calling something a miracle, and whether or not miracles affect our relationship to our own religious convictions. It's a very interesting question.
Okay, good.
Okay, but that's for Shabbat. Yep, Shirley.
so what I'm thinking is then tikkun olam, which is our partnership with God.
Mm-hmm.
So where there are to repair where things are not, where we see things are not right. So is it our onus on tikkun olam to repair where it's not good, where it's not right?
Well, that's definitely one of the ways of another response, is to say, okay, actually, I do see suffering and evil in the world, and my response is, rather than trying to find a philosophical explanation to be quietistic and passive, is to be activist and to say, I'm actually going to go out and be a co-creator or a co-redeemer of the world and be God's partner in redeeming what God created. That's not what Maimonides says, and that's not yet what we've seen in the wisdom text, but that's more of a prophetic response. The prophets would call on us to do that, but not the wisdom text so far. But you're right, that's definitely a response within the tradition. And that's what's so interesting, is that even in the Hebrew Bible, you have this symphony of divine voices, or at least of instructions, that are pointing us in all different directions depending on the situation and also how we're wired. Some people are wired for being activists and going out and saying, I feel the suffering of the world. Like the prophetic, one of the ways it's described is the prophet is like someone who has very thin skin, and they feel everything at a very high octave, and it pierces their skin and their neshama. Other people are more quietistic in terms of their approach, and they may want to be taking the stance of the sage. So between the prophet, the sage, and the priest, and maybe the king or the queen, there's different models in the Hebrew Bible. We're looking at specifically a few typologies of and ways of being in the world that come from the wisdom tradition. But what you're talking about right now, we haven't seen that either in the book of Ecclesiastes, which we looked at before, and right now in the book of Proverbs, there is no call to change anything in the world as it stands. This is more about looking at the world, observing it, and trying to find the wisdom to cope with it without changing it. That's a different perspective, right? But they're all Jewish. So stuff to think about for next time. Take a look again over chapter 2, and we may move on from chapter 2 to the third chapter for our next encounter together. So stay safe and sound and enjoy the rest of the Chokhmah that emerges from the Zot Chanukah. The end of Chanukah is a time where we're supposed to dwell in the wisdom that emerges from the light of the Chanukiah. Elyssa had a final comment?
Chag Sameach, that's it.
Chag Sameach.
Okay.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Urim Sameach. Good to see everybody. Stay safe.